Good evening. We are going to be talking today about the two other pilgrimage festivals. We spent a lot of time last session on Passover, which is one of the most observed Jewish holidays. In fact, the two most observed Jewish holidays outside of Israel are Passover and Hanukkah. Now, it's not a surprise because those are in the same season of the year as other festivals like Christmas and Easter. So there's a surrounding cultural support for them. Passover and Hanukkah are home holidays, not synagogue holidays. And today a majority of American Jews are not members of any synagogue. So there are a lot of factors why Passover and Hanukkah are some of the most observed holidays. And now we're getting into ones that are less observed, but historically were just as important as Passover. And Hanukkah, by the way, was a minor holiday historically, as we'll talk about. In fact, today sometimes people will say to me, we always celebrate the high holidays, Passover and Hanukkah. And they're wrong on both of them. Neither one of them is a high holiday by traditional definition, but those are the big ones that they are celebrating at home and that they do. So they've become high holidays as the big ones. So these two harvest festivals we'll be talking about today get a lot less attention, and it's too bad because both of them are actually really interesting and have very interesting historical developments and interesting themes that we might want to draw on, even from a secular and humanistic perspective. So again, I want to remind us that what we're talking about are originally harvest pilgrimage festivals that have an agricultural basis. So here's an example of a passage describing it in Exodus chapter 23, where it first describes Passover, the Chag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for 7 days in the month of Aviv in the spring. Remember, it's seasonal. Doesn't matter exactly what the date is on which month. And then you have Chag HaKatzir, the Feast of the Harvest, Bikurei Ma'asecha, the first fruits of your work, your labor, that you will plant in your fields, and Chag HaAsif, the Feast of Ingathering, B'tzeit HaShana, in the ending of the year, the leaving of the year. And again, if you think of the year as sort of defined by the harvest, you've got a spring harvest, a summer harvest, and a fall harvest. And so that's why these are the three major holidays. And by season, spring, summer, and fall. And then winter is sort of a not planting time, and so it's not defined by a harvest festival. Now, by the time the calendar develops further and you have priests defining the holidays, not just the agricultural cycle, which is presented in Leviticus chapter 23, now we get much more specificity. We saw the months are numbered, the specific day on the month is the time to harvest, and so on. So in Leviticus 23, it describes a holiday to be celebrated sometime after Passover, but as we'll see, the date is somewhat unclear. So you have described here earlier in 23, in the first month on the 14th day of the month, is the Pesach to Yahweh, then the Chag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as we've seen. And then, starting in verse 10, when you enter the land and you reap the harvest, you bring the first sheaf of the harvest to the priest, the Omer, which we'll see is what's counted later on. And he elevates the sheaf. On the day you elevate it, you have a burnt offering. And until that day, you will have no grain. You have to wait for that first elevation. And from the day you bring that Omer, that sheaf of the offering, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks, and they must be complete. You count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days, and then you bring an offering of new grain to Yahweh. You bring from your settlements 2 loaves as an offering, as first fruits to Yahweh. With the bread you present as burnt offerings, 7 lambs, 1 bull, 2 rams, because God likes meat. You have a he-goat as a sin offering, and 2 yearling lambs as a sacrifice of well-being, which the priests will elevate. On that same day, you hold a celebration. Again, that's day number 50. It'll be a sacred occasion for you with no work. This is a law for all time in all your settlements throughout the ages. And then it concludes with a nice ethical statement. When you reap the harvest of your land, you don't reap all the way to the edges of your field. So when you turn with the animals, you leave the corners there, or gather the gleanings. Whatever falls to the ground when you're harvesting the wheat, you leave that there. Don't go back and pick it up, leave that for the poor and for the stranger. So here we have this odd holiday, which is defined by counting 7 weeks. That's, by the way, the origin of the name of the holiday. It's called Shavuot, Shavuot is the word for a week, which is actually related to the word Sheva, which means 7. So Sheva is 7. A Shavuot is a cycle of 7. By the way, you may have heard the term someone sitting Shiva or going to a Shiva. It's because you were supposed to be in mourning for 7 days. So nowadays people do it for a weekend or 2 days or whatever. So I always laugh, we're sitting Shiva for 2 days. Well, technically Shiva means 7, but you're setting your 7 for 2. But as I always say, if the Big Ten can have more than 10 teams, then numbers don't really matter anymore. So yes, Shiva is for the number 7. Shavuot, a week, is 7. So Shavuot are weeks. And we talked in our earlier session about the calendar, about this septennial 7-based calendar that actually was built on these units of 7 and 7 by 7 and 7 by 7 by 7 to mark up the whole year. So this is an echo of that calendar, and there's actually some scholarly debate over whether that calendar was earlier or later, and this is a remnant of that, or was this a sort of coalition-building attempt to bring in an element of that calendar into this other seasonal calendar, priestly calendar, with a 12-month cycle? Not really clear. But in any case, there is an echo of this, that 7 calendar here in Shavuot. However, there is an ambiguity here. From the day on which you bring the sheaf of elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath. Well, which Sabbath? Is the day of the sheaf offering the beginning of Passover? Is it like the first night, that day? Do you do it on the Sabbath after the first night of Passover? Do you do it on the Sabbath after Passover is over? Because Passover runs for 7 days. What day are you counting from? And there's actually a debate in Second Temple Jewish history. We're talking from around 300 BCE to about 100 CE, rounding off. There was a debate over when you should mark this holiday. The temple in Jerusalem generally counted from the beginning of Passover, and that was rabbinic practice also to count this Omer, count this sheaf offering from the beginning of Passover, because the beginning of Passover is like a Shabbat. It's a stopping to work, and so they said it's like a Shabbat, let's count from there. Whereas the Book of Jubilees actually counted from the Shabbat after Passover, because they always wanted holidays to be on Shabbats or as close as possible. So this put Shavuot right around the Shabbat, right? Because if you're starting from after Shabbat and you count 7 weeks, you're going to be on the same day of the week coming out at the end. So that worked out for their calendar and their priorities. This holiday is also sometimes called the Chag HaBikurim, the festival of first fruits, because of the connection in the Torah text to that first fruit harvest when the Israelites conquered the land and entered the land. So this was an agricultural holiday with some temple sacrifices, but primarily focused on counting wheat and sheaves and so on. Now, by the time of Rabbinic Judaism, the situation gets a little bit more complicated because, first of all, some Jews aren't even agricultural anymore. They're not living on farms. They're working in cities, and so they don't have this harvesting cycle to live with. Of course, Rabbinic Judaism really takes over after the temple has been destroyed, so there's no more sacrifices, no goats, no lambs, no wheat. Where are you going to bring this wheat to? There's no place to go. And the other thing that the rabbis often do is, just as the priests would often add the Exodus story to an agricultural festival, the rabbis add a layer of the revealing of the Torah to the agricultural and priestly versions of it. And the same is true with Shavuot, because it's claimed in rabbinic thought that Shavuot actually marks the giving of the Torah. They claim that it took 7 weeks after the Exodus, and remember, the Exodus takes place on the first Passover, right? On the 15th of Nisan, and if you count 7 weeks from there, you land on the 6th of Sivan, which is a month and a little bit later, so almost 2 full months, but 1 week less than 2 full months. And that's the date that they decided was the date of the giving of the Torah. And they also worked Moses' 40 days up on the mountain in that same time frame. Of course, the Torah itself doesn't have an explicit date it was given, and it doesn't even say explicitly that it was Moses' Torah in the Torah itself. That appears elsewhere. Even the word Torah could just mean law in certain places, the Torah of leprosy, the Torah of tithes. It doesn't only refer to a whole book, and it'd be kind of odd for a book to refer to itself all the time as in terms of when it was given and written and so on. Now, the idea of taking Shavuot and reframing it as the giving of the Torah enables an emphasis on rabbinic law. Because remember, the rabbis believe not only in a written Torah that's given at Sinai, but also an oral Torah of rabbinic teaching that comes along with it to explain it and to clarify it, and also to add to it sometimes. Sometimes they'll say, where do we know this law from? It's a law from Moses on Sinai. It just goes back forever. We can't find a proof text. We just know it's always been a law. So making a major holiday about that revelation is a way to reinforce the claim that there was, in fact, a revelation of all these laws at one time in the Jewish past. The Talmud at one point even describes it as if it were the wedding day between God and Israel. That's one of the metaphors in the Song of Songs, for example, that's reworked, where God is the male lover and Israel is the bride, and so they're being matched up, so to speak. And in some Sephardic, Spanish-speaking Jewish communities, they have a special poem they read at this holiday called Le Ketubah de la Ley, the ketubah of the law, the marriage contract of the law. So in some ways, the Torah is seen as a kind of marriage agreement between the two. Now, there's a number of cultural traditions that were added to this celebration of this giving of the Torah, in addition to certain prayers and texts that are recited. One is to read the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth appears near the end of the Hebrew Bible, if you're looking at a Hebrew Bible. If you look at an Old Testament, it actually appears closer to the historical books, right after the book of Judges, which sort of makes sense because the first line of the book of Ruth is, in the days when the judges judged, and then it describes what happened there. So the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible that became the Old Testament, put Ruth back with the judges. But the rabbis who didn't write the Hebrew Bible but decided where things went and what was in and what was out, they put it later in the book, in the writing section, along with the other festival scrolls. So the Song of Songs is there because that's read at Passover. Ruth is there because that's read at Shavuot. The Book of Lamentations is read at the 9th of Av, the destruction of the temple holiday. Ecclesiastes is there because it's read during Sukkot, as we'll see. And the Megillah of Esther belongs there because it's also read at Purim. So these are all festivals, and it actually appears in the Hebrew Bible in the order they're read, from Passover first through Purim at the end in month 12. So it's following, again, the Bible calendar with the New Year, the festival New Year in the spring with Passover. But they put Ruth in because it was read for this festival. They decided to put it with the festival scrolls. Now, why would they assign the book of Ruth to be read during Shavuot? Well, we have to think about what's in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is about a Hebrew family that moves from Bethlehem down to Moab during a famine. And what's amusing is it's a famine in Bethlehem, which means house of bread. So you'd think we wouldn't have a famine there, but there is. And while they're there, the man and his two sons, who married Moabite women, all die. And so there's a mother-in-law named Naomi and two daughters-in-law who begin the journey back to Bethlehem, to her family house. And on the way, she tells them, go back to your people. What am I going to do? Am I going to give birth to sons and they're going to marry you in the future? Like, you're not going to wait for them. It's not going to work. So one of them kisses her and goes back, but the other one, Ruth, says, no, I'm going with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I'll be buried. And that's it. You're not getting rid of me. So Naomi comes back to Bethlehem, and Ruth is with her. And while there, they begin to glean from the fields, as widows and orphans do. And she catches the eye of a wealthy farmer there named Boaz. And he's actually one of her kinsmen through her dead husband. But there's someone closer in line to him who has a prior claim on her. So they have to go through a whole legal rigmarole to get him to release his claim on her so that he can then marry her. And ultimately, he does marry her. She gives birth to a son named Perez, who becomes, I think, the grandfather of King David, it says at the end of the book. So why include the book of Ruth as part of Shavuot? Well, clearly the focus on the harvest and the gleaning and the charity for the widows, that fits right in with what we read in Leviticus 23 of the reasoning behind the holiday. Some would argue that the time at Sinai, this giving of the covenant, was like the creation of the Hebrew nation. And so by having someone else join that people, it's sort of a reenactment of that definition of the community by her conversion experience. And another connection that was offered is that King David supposedly died around the time of Shavuot, Again, it's not specified in the Hebrew Bible, but the rabbis, it's like a soap opera, there's no loose ends. They got to tie everyone up, and everyone's connected to somebody, and this date had to be meaningful for that, and so they make it David's death date. And so this is, again, a connection to Ruth because she's the ancestor of King David. Ruth is a wonderful story for people who are interested in an open Jewish people and welcoming people into the Jewish family. The Moabites are actually a people who are prohibited from joining the congregation of Israel because of their enmity with the Hebrews. Their origin story is that they are the children of incest from Lot and his daughters when he's drunk after Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. So who would want to marry those bastards, literally? The backstory to Ruth is fascinating too because it's probably written around the same time as the book of Ezra, and Ezra is very anti-intermarriage, whereas Ruth seems to be very pro-intermarriage because she's very ethical and caring and becomes the ancestor of David and is allowed to be part of the community and so on. And has this conversion narrative too, where she actually says, literally, your people are my people now. So the book of Ruth being read here is an interesting one, connecting it to Shavuot for a variety of reasons. Another tradition that was added was to add greenery and flower decorations to the synagogue or to the home. This is seasonal, of course. It's summer. Everything's green. It's a good time to bring in flowers. However, some rabbis were concerned that this was too redolent of Christian practices, and so they decided to switch to paper cuts instead. And so there's actually a tradition of doing Jewish paper cut art as part of the holiday at that time of year. Another tradition attached to Shavuot was the eating of dairy foods. Now, why dairy foods? I'll give you 3 rabbinic reasons and then what I think is the actual reason. The first rabbinic reason is this is the time they received the Torah. And what's one of the most important rules in the Torah? How to kosher slaughter animals. Well, guess what? All of their dishes were treif. All of their dishes were no longer kosher anymore because they weren't slaughtering them the right way. Now, again, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah itself, says nothing about how to slaughter animals, to cut the artery, to drain the blood, to salt the meat, to separate milk and meat. Like, that's not explicitly anywhere in there. This is a rabbinic law, but because the rabbis imagined the written and oral Torah are all given perfectly at the same time at Sinai, they assume, well, they didn't have their meat and milk plates separately, so they didn't have kosher on what to eat, so they went with dairy instead. They decided it was safer to use dairy. All their meat they had slaughtered was treif already because they did it wrong, and so they went with dairy. That's one traditional reason. A second reason has to do with a phenomenon called gematria. Gematria is where you take the number values of the Hebrew letters and find other connections with it. So an aleph is a 1, a bet is a 2, gimel is a 3, and so on. And then once you get to 9, it becomes 10, 20, 30 for the letters that follow. And the gematria value of chalav, which means milk, is 40. What's the connection between 40 and Shavuot? Moses is up on the mountain, right, for 40 days and 40 nights. So that's why you should eat dairy dishes to remind you of the 40 days and 40 nights. I'm sure there are other words that also have a gematria value of 40. It may not be so meaningful. Another example that's given is that in Psalm 68, Sinai is referred to as Har HaGavnunim, the mountain of majestic peaks. But Gavnunim sounds a bit like Gavina, which means cheese. So therefore we should be eating dairy. Okay. So
there seem to be a lot of sort of puns. Well, there seem to be a lot of wordplay.
Yes, wordplay, pun. But remember, if you believe in a God who designed everything, including the Hebrew language, then maybe he hid little revelations to be found in the number value and in the, these kind of wordplay. Don't read it this way, read it that way. It can have multiple meanings, style of writing. Now, my perspective on what the actual reason is, remember, Passover is celebrating the birth of the lambs, right? And you sacrifice one of those lambs, but you have other lambs and goats and baby sheep that have been born, and baby calves of cattle. What happens about 40 or 50 days after they're born? They wean. What do you get when you've got lactating animals that have weaned their young? You get to get milk and dairy. It's dairy season. This is not the era of the factory farm where we forcibly impregnate the animals get the kids, wean them right away, suck as much milk as we can, then get them pregnant. I mean, they don't lactate all the time forever. They stop. It's only after the birth and the weaning. So this is dairy season. So my guess is the reason why there's dairy at Shavuot is because it was dairy season, and that was what was available. And again, pre-refrigeration, you want to eat the stuff right away. You don't wait forever for that. Okay. Another tradition that evolved in the Middle Ages, connected to Shavuot, and you can see they're sort of adding stuff onto Shavuot that almost transforms it in a way that Passover doesn't really happen. You have a Seder instead of the sacrifices, but you're telling the story and you're eating the ritual foods, and a lot of it has deep textual connections, as we saw. But Shavuot, you're coming up with stuff because, again, you don't have a temple to bring the sacrifices to, and you're sort of scrambling for what to do. So beginning in the Middle Ages, Jewish mystical circles around 1533 or so began doing what they called a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, a study session all night on the night of Shavuot. So beginning as the sun was going down to the beginning of Shavuot, they would study all night long. They would study Torah and Talmud and mystical texts. And the idea was that it had a kind of mystical value. Tikkun in Jewish mystical thought had this concept of cosmic repair. Like Tikkun Olam was a cosmic repairing of the divine sparks that you were putting together again. So these all-night study sessions had a mystical orientation to them, but they also, some people speculated, were facilitated by the Turkish discovery of coffee. Because if you're going to be up all night, it helps to have some caffeine to keep you going. Another interesting connection with Shavuot that starts in the Middle Ages is it becomes the first day of school for a lot of school children. They would bring them in at a certain age, the age to start learning, I think age 5 or so, and they would bring them in, they would teach them their first letters and vowels, and they would actually put honey on the books and have the kids lick the honey off the book so they got a sweet taste in their mouth that connects the learning with being sweet. It's a very early case of operant conditioning when it comes to child education. Now, they also did a lot of corporal punishment in those schools, so we can't say they were psychological geniuses, but at least that was one positive thing. In the 19th and 20th centuries, new additions were added to this holiday. So when the Reform movement came up with the idea of a confirmation as a replacement for Bar Bat Mitzvah as a coming-of-age ceremony modeled on what the Lutheran Church was doing, they often chose Shavuot as the date to do that. Because, again, it's a time of learning, it's a time of wisdom. Even if they didn't believe in the literal Torah all being given at that time, because they were Reformed. They didn't believe in the oral Torah as fully binding. That's why they also began to shift the meaning of the holiday. You began to hear things like that Shavuot is when the 10 Commandments were given. Again, it's a way of, well, we want to keep the 10 Commandments as something divine, but we don't believe the whole Torah written and oral was given then, so they begin to shift the meaning. Instead of the whole Torah being given, now you hear that the 10 Commandments were given on Shavuot. And that's a sort of shifted claim. It's still imagining, the Charlton Heston on the mountain with the finger of God, lightning, writing on the stones and all that. That's still the imagery there, but just for that, not for the whole 5 books. And you also, when you have the beginning of a return to Israel with the modern Zionist movement, now they're harvesting again. And they're harvesting with the right cycle. I mean, the first fruits aren't necessarily growing in Poland or Russia, but they are growing in the land of Israel. One of the niche markets, by the way, that Israel has maintained is their citrus ripens a few weeks earlier than it does in Europe. And so they make a lot of money in those few weeks when they can sell fresh fruit to Europe before it's ripe there, just because of the seasonal shift in the latitudes. So the same is true with the first fruits now. They were getting first fruits, and they could have it on Shavuot, as the original holiday had indicated. I'll also point out that the assigned Torah reading from the rabbis for Shavuot was Exodus chapter 19 and 20, which is about the giving of the 10 Commandments. So that 10 Commandments overlay was not out of nowhere. They were drawing on some sources. Now, one other detail with Shavuot I do want to mention before we open up for comments, questions, and also think about what we might do with this holiday as secular and humanistic Jews, is, remember, you're counting the days between Passover and Shavuot. There's actually a break day in the middle of the counting. Because during the counting, it's thought to be a bad omen time. You're not allowed to get a haircut. You're not allowed to shave. There's no instrumental music. There's no weddings allowed. There's no parties. You can't even have dinners that have dancing involved. The claim is that there was a plague that was striking Rabbi Akiva's students. Akiva was a rabbi who lived around the year 100 of the Common Era, a little bit afterwards, and his students were being struck by a plague, or by Roman persecution. It's not exactly clear. But the plague ended on the 33rd day of counting the Omer. So that becomes a release day. Lag BaOmer, which just stands for 33rd day, Lamed is 30, Gimel is 3. So Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of counting the Omer, becomes a release day where you can get a haircut and you can have a wedding and you can do these things. In fact, Lag BaOmer, on the kids' theme, became a day of a first haircut around age 3 in Eastern Europe. So you get all these kids with their long hair going for their first haircut on Lag BaOmer. That was the day of haircuts allowed. But there were also interesting traditions added to that. People began making bonfires on Lag BaOmer because you could, and it was a time for celebrating. And there was a story that Rabbi Akiva would go in the woods claiming to be hunting, even if he was teaching Torah. He was not allowed to teach Torah, but he claimed they were a hunting party, so they always had bows and arrows with them to keep up the ruse. So now people have archery contests as an echo of that story. The date of Lag BaOmer is also thought to be the death date of a rabbi named Shimon bar Yochai, who was a contemporary of Akiva's, but was thought to be much more mystically focused. And he's claimed to be the author of the Zohar, which is actually a medieval Jewish mystical text, but claimed to be authored by somebody centuries before. What else is new? And Shimon bar Yochai's grave is in the land of Israel in a place called Mount Meron, or what's claimed to be his grave, is in Mount Meron, and it's a site of pilgrimage on Lag BaOmer. Particularly for Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, where they have bonfires and people go to the grave and pray for healing or for pregnancy. Actually, is one of the things you can ask him to intervene on. But this last year they did it because it was post-COVID shutdown and everybody went. They had almost 100,000 attendees, which was way more than the site could handle. And there was a massive crowd disaster. It killed 45 people and 150 people wounded with a trampling, and it was terrible. So that's the risk of these kind of festivals. When you get too many people there, it becomes a mess. But these are, again, trying to find reasons for these holidays. If you read a code of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch, they'll give you, here's all the things that happened on this date, and they give you 7 different things. And if it was only one of them, you would have made it a holiday. But the fact they give 7 different things, it suggests that they're coming up with a reason when this is already a pre-existing observance. So what I want to do is stop there, and I want to ask if there are any comments or questions before we go to what we do with this thing.
Okay, I have a quick question. So the 34th day, do you revert back to the prohibitions, or everything after the 33rd day is okay for haircuts?
My understanding is that you're released on the 33rd day going forward, although some communities actually include the 33rd day in the morning stuff and release on the 34th day. So different Jewish populations.
16 days, basically.
Right, you got 16 or 17 days more or less that you're released again. Although I think some of the prohibitions stay, others don't. I'm not sure exactly the breakdown. I've read conflicting sources on that.
And Omer means sheep?
The wheat sheaf, yeah. So counting the Omer. And actually, if you read a Haggadah, like the Maxwell House Haggadah or other examples, at a certain point near the end of the Seder, you say, this is the first day of counting the Omer. And there's actually a quirky ritual. Sometimes, like the verbal gymnastics that rabbis come up with are really either clever or maddening. This one is, if you ask someone, what day is today's Omer? They're not supposed to say what number it is until they're saying the prayer service when they're supposed to say it. So instead, you answer them with, yesterday was the 24th. So you say the one that's already been done. You don't say what today is, because if you did, then you have to be in the right setting to do that. So it's one of those quirky things. Another example related to Shabbat that I love is on Shabbat, Jews are not supposed to turn on lights. It's thought to be completing a circuit, which is like building a house. And so there's this tradition of having what's called the Shabbos Goy, the non-Jew who's designated to help you out on Shabbat, come over and do it, except you're not allowed to explicitly ask them to do something for you. They have to be doing it for themselves, and then you get the benefit from it. So like you get on the elevator and they hit 6, you get to go to 6, but they did it for themselves. So what you do when you invite them over is you invite them over to a dark house, and you say, boy, it'd be so much easier to share a glass of schnapps if someone turned on a light. And then the person turns it on for themselves, and you give them a glass of schnapps, and then off they go. So, this is the workaround language of legalism. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, questions on Shavuot before we talk about what might work for us to celebrate this holiday?
So, any other thoughts on this? So, what are some things that we might connect with out of this holiday? Well, it's always good for city dwellers to remind themselves that their food comes from somewhere, right? That agriculture is an important part of not only the economy, but the cycle of life and how we survive. So appreciating farmers and food workers is certainly a valuable thing to do. Everybody loves a big fire, right? Why not do bonfires? Even if we don't necessarily agree with the story behind it, we can enjoy the tradition that Jews did this at this time of year.
What do people normally do on Shavuot? I mean,
Well, they have these study sessions. They have a special feast with dairy foods, blintzes, things like that. They'll sometimes do these bonfires or archery contests. I mean, again, it's really sort of an undefined holiday.
it's current now.
Yeah. Yeah, it was
So, Rabbi, if
robust. Yeah.
this is the holiday of the giving of the Torah, what is Simchas Torah?
We're going to talk about that later because it's at the end of Sukkot. Simchat Torah is when you start the reading cycle over again.
Oh,
But
okay.
it's not necessarily when you got the Torah. So they got the Torah in the summer at Shavuot. They didn't start the reading cycle until after Sukkot. So that's there are two holidays connected to Torah, but you've highlighted the fact that Sukkot is also tied to the Torah story by the rabbis, even if there's not as clear a connection to it as you might have thought. Now, what do we do with a holiday that's all about the giving of the Torah? Well, that's going to be a tricky one. Because if you don't believe that Moses got the Torah on Sinai, then maybe you won't celebrate it. In fact, I found once a calendar of holidays that was defined by an early secular Jewish school in like 1919 or 1920, one of the early workman's circle schools. And they defined what holidays they were going to celebrate. They did not celebrate the high holidays because those were religious. They did celebrate Hanukkah as a resistance to assimilation. They celebrated Purim as like a masquerade kind of holiday. They celebrated Passover. I mean, if you're a socialist, like what better holiday is there than Passover, right? And slaves rebelling against their masters, it's perfect. But they didn't celebrate Shavuot. They did celebrate Lag BaOmer as a remembrance of Rabbi Akiva and the revolt against the Romans that he was a part of. So they like the revolt against the Romans part, the anti-imperialism part. So they counted the 33rd day to what? They weren't counting to 50 because they didn't care about Shavuot. So, this was a really hard one for secular Jews. The Israeli kibbutz movement was able to go back to the first fruits piece of it. What we've tried to do in recent years is connect it with learning. If the Torah can sometimes be a stand-in for wisdom or as our earliest Jewish book, then maybe we celebrate all Jewish books. It's a harvest of wisdom. So this is the beginning point, but not the end point of learning. So you can celebrate different forms of books, the scroll, the codex, the Kindle e-reader. You can celebrate books on different subjects. You can celebrate nonfiction books, science and history and math and those kind of things. So you can make it a celebration of learning. But I'll be candid, in most of our communities, we don't do that much for Shavuot because it often happens after the Sunday school year is over. Mid to late May, usually we're out before around Memorial Day, and if it doesn't happen during the Sunday school year, just like the fast days over the summer, we may not do that much with it in our congregational settings.
I do believe that in the olden days, Bethor did a book fair.
Right. So doing a book fair around Shavuot might be a very popular time to do that. And actually, in the old days of Bethor, they did do bonfires, but they did them on Sukkot. When it was an outdoor sukkah festival, they didn't do it at Shavuot, which I was sort of surprised at. But maybe sometimes here it's not quite warm enough for outdoor events in May, or at least maybe used to be. I don't know. Anyways, So we have opportunities to reclaim Shavuot. I mean, you can certainly make it a holiday of math because you have the 7 by 7 by 7 and do that calendar. And kids that like math might enjoy that a lot more than kids that, than having to read more books if that's not what they're fans of.